The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with, even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. I need to adjust this lamp a little bit. So today is the first day of this second in a row sesshin here in May 2021. The last sesshin we ended just a week ago in the end of April. It's a wonderful opportunity, an incredible opportunity to do 2 in a row or even 3 in a row. It's not so easy in the United States to do that because people have, unless they're living in a monastery, have outside responsibilities in general. And that provides time constraints that prevent the chance to do the kind of a boom boom or a boom 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 sesshin. But when we can do it, it is incredible. When I was in my first full year at Sogenji, in November, there was a 7-day sesshin right at the end of November. And about 4 days later, there was Rohatsu, which is an 8-day sesshin, quite strenuous in that we basically got, if you wanted to sleep, 2 hours of sleep at night, which, by the way, is quite wretched. It was easier to stay awake. And then less than a week later, there was a second December sesshin. And so you didn't really have a chance to go back down to square one in your practice. Each sesshin was so close to the other one that you built on what you'd already deepened into. And it was phenomenal. Before it happened, I was a little concerned about how it would be. It sounded awfully intense. And it was, but not in a negative way, intense in a way filled with opportunity. And so, fortunately, thanks to some suggestions here, we were able to do these 2 in a row here in April, May 2021. And I would love to do this many times, at least every year, because the benefits to each person who takes place in it are phenomenal, really. We are able to go so much deeper when we don't stop. And of course, if we're serious about practice, we don't stop anyway, but we go back to our daily life and all the other involvements that are tugging and pulling at our attention. And so it's really impossible, unless you're in sesshin, to keep the depth of practice, focus going onward. So this is a tremendous, tremendous opportunity. I'd like to share with you now some of the words of Kalu Rinpoche. Kalu Rinpoche was a Tibetan master, deeply realized Tibetan master, who used to come through Santa Fe in the 1980s. He died in 1989 at the age of 85. And those of us who had come out from the Rochester Zen Center went and heard his talks, and they were very helpful. They were very inspiring. And here I want to say something about Zen practice and how far and wide we spread it. In the beginning, as Kalu Rinpoche used to say in all the workshops, you keep 2 eyes open. When you're looking for a teacher, you keep both eyes open. You're not only aware of the connection with that teacher, but you're also aware of, it's a dose of reality. Is this teacher reasonably ethical? I would say even more than reasonably ethical. Is your teacher ethical? And to that, I have to say that Mitra-roshi, among all of his peers in the United States at the time, was exemplary in his ethical behavior. In an era when other teachers, particularly the imported teachers, and some of the American teachers, at least one of the American teachers, who was kind of contemporary, were fooling around with their students, and that is not a good sign. At any rate, once you settle on a teacher, then it's important to stick with that teacher and dedicate yourself to the training that they offer for a significant period of time, at least until you have some insight. Because once you get the insight, and it doesn't have to be a deep insight, but at least some insight, definite familiarity with ongoing practice for an extended period of time, so that you're not just jettisoning the practice because it's become uninteresting or challenging, but you're opening to the input of other teachers that may inspire you in actually going deeper in that practice. And this is what we realized was going on for us in Santa Fe when we went to hear Kalu Rinpoche. He was amazingly clear, and we had a way of presenting the Dharma that was so readily accessible. He was born in 1904 in Tibet. And when he was 13, he was recognized as a tulku, that is a reincarnation, and was actually, I think he was recognized before that, but it doesn't give a date for that. It does say that when he was 13, he was ordained as a monk. And when he was 16, he entered his first 3-year, 3-month, 3-day meditation retreat, and continued deep training. And also, as he got deeper, began to share his insight in inspiring other people in Tibet. He was still in Tibet. When he was 25, though, he chose to become a wandering yogi and really settled down into deep exploration of the nature of mind, which is what our practice is about, really. We are searching for who and what we really are. Because those of us drawn to spiritual practice have some sense that there's something that it is maybe below the surface, something that is just beyond the veil, as one person put it, that we knew at one time and is essential to return to. And that is a comprehension of our mind. And we do it through, in the Rinzai system, we do it through a combination of the extended out breath called Sissokkan and Koan practice. But it can be inspirational, as I said, at a certain point in our practice. And I don't feel like it's appropriate to bounce around early on. But as you have gone deeper in your practice to be inspired, to open to the teachings of other masters, to stay your course in your current practice, but to use the teachings of, or your awareness of the teachings of other masters to deepen that practice and inspire its course. Over millennia, there have been teachers in every single culture that have been true masters. The China, we have many names, Joshu or Chaocho, and many others. It went to Korea. It went to Tibet, where we have many current masters, and not most of them not in Tibet because of the Chinese occupation. Most of them have fled and are living in India or traveling the world. And I think Makyo Rinpoche and his whole family, all his brothers are also considered to be tulkus and are highly revered teachers, as was his father, Kalu Rinpoche, who, again, I said died in 1989, but in 1990, apparently his incarnation was recognized. It doesn't say anything about who that was, but at this point, that person must be about 30 years old. Is that right? Yeah. So, and then in Japan, there have been significant masters. Mitra-roshi was only one in his generation. There were others, and currently there's Harada Shodo-roshi, Tongan Roshi, who has died, and then there were Korean masters in former times and also relatively contemporary, and also Vietnamese, Burmese masters, not in Zen, they were in Vipassana, but Mahasi Sayadaw was somebody, and in Thailand, Ajahn Chah. There have been many, many masters, and in the United States also. And I count Roshi Kapleau, despite what people have denigrated him relentlessly in the past, he was truly a master in a field where many who were originally considered masters were not really masters, because they had not mastered the entire spectrum of combination of awakening and enlightened behavior. But he had, and he continued to work on it all the way through to his dying breath. It remains to be seen whether we will find masters in this generation of such note, but I think we have a good chance of it. Although in America it's a little bit challenging. America is not a country where people are interested in monastic training, which is fine. It's not essential. Actually, to become a householder, or to be a householder and do deep Zen training is not only difficult, but can be highly effective. And one of the things about being in a monastery for life is that you have a limited range of experience. You're in a cloistered environment, and so everything is arranged in the environment to enhance your practice and the practice of your fellow monks. But I think here of Jack Kornfield, who was a forest monk in Thailand, I believe under Ajahn Chah actually, for 5 years. And he was basically in a situation where he was more than in a monastery, although it was considered a monastery. He was essentially doing lone practice, solo practice for those 5 years, except for occasionally when the monks would gather and hear a talk by the master or get some form of guidance by him. And so after 5 years, Jack Kornfield felt like he was pretty well awake, and that his life was going fine. And so he decided to return to the United States. And as soon as he went back into his old environment, he discovered that his old habit patterns, which had lain dormant while he was in the forest in Thailand, suddenly reappeared. And he wasn't as enlightened as he thought he was. And so, to his credit, he went back to school and became a clinical psychologist, because that was right about when the shit was hitting the fan in terms of misbehaviors by so-called masters in the United States. And he, like a number of others, was very concerned about this and recognized that just nose to the grindstone in a monastery did not necessarily equip you for life, a full life in society. And it doesn't. I mean, in a certain way, it will, in that if you're particularly in a large monastery where there are many monks and everyone has their own personality, and of course, people are bumping into each other all the time. And the what is perceived as pressure in the practice, in the Zen practice, makes people tend to get a little on edge sometimes. Along with, for example, at Zongenji, the hours are pretty intense. There's not much time for rest. And so one can get a little bit, or even a lot, irritated. But even just going to one sesshin, whether or not you're in a monastery, can bring up stuff that will result in some irritation during sesshin. I remember in Rochester, one sesshin where it was before they modified the use of the kyosaku. Kyosaku being the so-called encouragement stick, which really was only used for encouragement in Rochester. It was not used as punishment or abuse. It was used in an honest, earnest effort to help people concentrate more deeply. And but there was a lot of it. And in fact, there were people who received a lot of keisaku strikes. Kyosaku. Keisaku is what it's called in Rinzai. And found themselves with scars about this big around on each shoulder, where the kyosaku had relentlessly struck during a given sesshin. That doesn't happen anymore. That was an outcome of Kepler-Roshi's Japanese master Yasutani and his samurai history. But nonetheless, it can be intense. And during this particular sesshin, I could see out of the side of my eyes a couple of people down the row from me who, when the monitor came around and started using keisaku, this person whirled around, grabbed the kyosaku, and wrestled the monitor to the floor. A clear indication that he'd had enough. I don't know. I don't remember who it was. I'm not sure I ever did know who it was. And I don't know what the consequences were back then. We don't use kyosaku or keisaku here because we have a small zendo. And also many of the people who come here have a history of trauma. And for a person with a history of trauma, even to have somebody else struck in the zendo can be re-traumatizing. So there's no point in that. Moreover, when I announced that we were no longer going to be using it, one of our participants was alarmed. And it turns out he had been, he was a transfer from Rochester, basically. It had been in what was known as the hot seat in many, many sesshin, and so was accustomed to the kyosaku, readily used on him in particular. And he was a big guy, strong, and it was effective for him. Unfortunately, it was a little too effective because his alarm was that really, how could he practice without it? And so it was recognized that it can be addictive as well. The important thing for us is to learn to draw on our own resources to deepen our practice. And there are many, many mind states we go through in our years of Zen practice. Some of them are inspiring and others are not. Some of them can be frightening or unpleasant, and others can be sweet and lovely, which is just as dangerous, by the way. In fact, perhaps more dangerous. And others can be a blah. I remember years ago at Rochester when on the 7th day of sesshin, I suddenly had absolutely no interest in practice, absolutely none. And I had been dedicated for several years. And then I thought, that's odd. It had never happened to me before. The next sesshin, it happened on the 6th day. Next sesshin, it happened on the 5th day. And I began to see a pattern here. And so I also recognized that, well, let's say a thought came to me that I didn't want to experience Kensho. I didn't want to have awakening, which was a little odd because I had gone into Zen practice with a deep understanding that there was nothing else that would ever bring me lasting peace and happiness more than extremely temporarily. And so that kept me, I thought, committed to Zen practice. So it was quite puzzling, this. And I wanted to talk to Roshi about it because it concerned me, which also is a sign that it was a big, fat Makyo. He refused to see me, which was his gift to me, really. And demonstrates his depth as a teacher as well. What that did, particularly when combined with the fact that I was not accepted to the next sesshin, and I'd always been accepted to sesshin, suddenly there was a stab of fear in my heart and regret and remorse. And thankfully, the next sesshin I was accepted to, and very soon after that, I did get passed on my breakthrough koan. I realized that that sense of flatness, I may as well have been walking down the street in a desert somewhere, although a desert was probably going to be more interesting than that mind state. But it was my last-ditch effort of attempting to hold myself back. And this is something to recognize in our Zen practice. When we find ourselves flat, when we find ourselves disinterested, when we feel like the juice has gone out of our practice, it could be a big fat Makyo that is trying to prevent, or we are trying to prevent ourselves, because nobody else makes Makyo for us. We are trying to prevent ourselves from going deeper because we're getting too close. It's getting too dangerous. We are getting to a point where in the next few steps, we may be letting go. And letting go is frightening for most people. And that is a time when fear does come up. So Kalu Rinpoche spent many years wandering, deepening his practice. And then he began seriously teaching. And it doesn't say anything about how he got to the West. At some point, he fled Tibet, along with so many others, and ended up teaching basically all over the world. So I'd like to share some of his words with you as inspiration to your own practice, because, as I said, the Tibetans have a very effective way of expressing practice in a subject matter that is very difficult to express, because coming to awakening is beyond words. There are no words that can express it. There is a sense of profound freedom, depending on how deeply one awakens. And of course, it is hoped that one will continue practice and have many further awakening experiences. And also, not only that, but awakening in another expression of Kalu Rinpoche's was like a flash of lightning in the dark night. And the image is that you're struggling to find your way up a mountain path, an unfamiliar mountain path in the dark. And suddenly there's a flash of lightning, and it gives you a sense of the next steps in your path. It shows you the way. And a decent kensho will do that. Initially, again, if it's deep enough, our habit patterns of greed, anger, and delusion are sort of blown out of the water, and there is a sense of immense freedom. Unbelievable freedom, incalculable freedom. And then things come rolling back in, and we find ourselves suddenly with these habit patterns. And there's two forms of Zen sickness that can come out of that. One is if our opening has not been very deep, we get a real swelled head about it, and we go around crowing inwardly, at least, and sometimes outwardly, about our accomplishment. And that's one form of Zen sickness. And another form, what we have seen, what we have experienced, is not matching what we are seeing in our behavior, experiencing in our habit patterns, our thought, our speech, our behavior. Afterwards, there's a real challenge there. It's like, how come I can act like I understood? And so we have a lot of work to do. We always have a lot of work to do in bringing our behavior into line with what we have realized. And even before a kensho experience, our practice, as we go deeper, will begin to reveal a clarity of mind in which we will become little by little aware of where our behavior is less than optimal. And then we have a choice. We can stuff it and keep on with our old habit patterns, which is what John Wellwood called doing an end run around our issues. Or we can really get to work, own it, feel the regret, feel the remorse, feel the commitment to not behave in that way anymore. And then it's easy not to. The habit pattern will come up a few more times. And as we continue to stay present with it and own it, it will diminish in its power until finally it just doesn't come up anymore. This is an essential part of our Zen practice. It's kind of why we come to awakening. We don't come to awakening just for the joy of the experience. We come to the awakening because it offers us a significant view that we can manifest after a lot of work. So, Kalu Rinpoche, this is a book called Luminous Mind, The Way of the Buddha. And here I am going to quote the nature of mind. This is this chapter on the nature of mind. And it's led by a quote from the third Karmapa in a poem called Wishes of Mahamudra. And it reads, all phenomena are projections of the mind. All phenomena are projections of the mind. Mind is not a mind. The mind is empty in essence. Although empty, everything constantly arises in it. Through the deepest examination of the mind, may we find its innermost root. And you can't see it because my head is blocking it, and also our wonderful figure of Kuan Yin is blocking it. But the scroll behind me over the altar reads, out of not one thing arise the 10,000 things. And that's what this says. All phenomena are projections of the mind. Mind is not a mind. The mind is empty of essence, in essence. Although empty, everything constantly arises in it. Out of not one thing arise the 10,000 things. Through the deepest examination of the mind, may we find its innermost root. That is what we are doing on the cushion or in the chair. We are examining our mind, searching for the root. Kalu Rinpoche writes, or speaks, this is a translation. The actual experience of the essential nature of mind is beyond words. To wish to describe it is like the situation of a mute who wants to describe the flavor of a candy in his mouth. He lacks an adequate means of expression. Even so, I would like to offer some ideas that hint at this experience. The nature of pure mind can be thought of as having three essential complementary and simultaneous aspects: openness, clarity, and sensitivity. This is this luminous awareness that is spoken of also in the Chinese tradition. Luminous awareness. There's nobody, no thing being aware. The luminosity reveals all manner of things. With regard to openness, mind is what thinks I am, I want, I don't want. It is the thinker, the observer, and the subject of all experiences. I am the mind. From one point of view, this mind does exist since I am, and I have a capacity for action. If I want to see, I can look. If I want to hear, I can listen. If I decide to do something with my hands, I can command my body, and so on. In this sense, the mind and its faculties seem to exist. But if we search for it, which is our primary role on the cushion, we cannot find any part of it in us. Not in our head, not in our body, or anywhere else. So from this other perspective, it seems not to exist. Therefore, on the one hand, the mind seems to exist, but on the other, it is not something that truly exists. Form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. Who are we? What are we? If I'm not this me, what am I? And yet I am this me and I am not this me. But what is this me? The changing range of experiences. Search deeply within. Deeply within. This mind has no beginning and no end. This face before your parents were born is your very own face right now. What is it? Who are you? Dig deep, dig deep. And with that, I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.